If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today, I want to talk about some challenges to our notion of creating productivity in our world. It's going to have to do with the notion of the productivity paradox, which is about a 30-year-old notion now, but it's been a little bit updated because it seems to still be in play for us. And we'll talk about what that is and what it means. The background, though, is most everybody involved in knowledge work is involved with technology. It's what we do. We deal in information, so the particular flavor of technology that we have is information technology. And we believe that it makes us more productive. That is, it makes us better at our jobs. But what's the evidence that information technology is helping us be more productive? After all, that is its purpose in the modern workplace, is to help us be more productive, right? I'd suggest that a lot of people believe that the tech companies are dealing with this on our behalf. In other words, the software that is produced and that we buy is helping us with our productivity. And I think software companies would tell you a similar story, that yes, they're improving your productivity, but there's a ton of contrary evidence to that. And we'll dig into some of it today. Also, both solopreneurs and companies are really just flinging themselves into IT. And the argument is, as the argument has always been with IT, that AI will make us more efficient, more productive. And there are good reasons to doubt that. So all this, we'll unpack it and we'll figure out what's going on at a greater level of detail. But first, let's talk about the productivity paradox. So in the 90s, there was a great deal of discussion around the productivity of technology. And the term productivity paradox was coined to describe the mismatch between the belief that IT, with its huge resource spend, was making us more productive. So that was the belief. But then when we looked at the economic productivity in the nation, it was flat. So we're spending all this money on something that should make us more productive, and it actually wasn't, at least not in the macroeconomic stats and not in the last part of the 20th century. Fast forward, IT spending declined. For a while, it was redirected towards the Y2K bug and the Y2K problem. So the spending stayed there, but it was reallocated towards that problem and away from productivity, desktop productivity tools. And then came the dot-com bust, and that sort of, what would you say, decreased our affection for the productivity of IT. And the productivity paradox was a big point of discussion at that point. So this problem of spending didn't seem as dire, and we started thinking about some other things. And now we've got smartphones and that personal productivity, and on the apps keep rolling out, and we presumably keep spending on them, and we presumably get better and better with our productivity. But we got distracted with some other things. Now, the productivity paradox is coming back into the business thinking as our spending on software has returned and is continuing to rise. Now, this time we know a little more about software's productivity problem. We're a little bit better armed to look for it. As a knowledge worker, you need to know, particularly as a solopreneur, you need to know as you plan your own IT spending. You need to understand whether or not IT by itself helps us improve our productivity, either for yourself as a solopreneur or for your team as a manager of knowledge workers. So if your IT spending is not actually improving your productivity or your team's productivity, you get two problems. One is you're wasting money, and two is you may not have another plan for improving your own productivity or the productivity of the people that work for you. So we'll get into it. Now, the original productivity paradox considered that the problem might be that we're just writing the wrong applications, or we've got to build a certain amount of IT infrastructure in place before it starts getting traction in terms of our productivity numbers. All these different ideas were floated around. And then it went away for several years, and now it's beginning to make a comeback, at least in some circles, this notion that we need to be getting productivity out of our software spend, and this concern that we're not. So the thinking, at least one school of thought now, is that we're applying technology to the wrong scope of problem. And what I mean by that is that we're tending towards IT as a point solution rather than an overall solution. We know that businesses produce things because of processes, that businesses engage in this procedural work, and that's how we produce outcomes. Sometimes that procedural work is embodied in physical equipment, as in a factory. Other times that procedural work is teamwork, our standard practices. These kinds of things are the processes that businesses use. And we look at those processes, and they're divided up amongst individual people, and they're divided across individual workers. So everybody has a step in the process. And what we fear that we tend to do is we tend to optimize at the individual task level or at the individual worker level. And so we buy IT at that level, and we decide whether or not it's best for us at that level, whether or not it's the right IT at that level. And we don't have a larger view of, well, if we're going to buy a CRM solution for this department, then this other department that needs a CRM as well, it would be useful if they could agree on which CRM they need. So we're not looking across the organization, and we'll talk about the problem that that causes here in a minute. We struggle a little bit to learn from each other here. So we don't work across internally for a common application of a technology. We tend to let that happen inside the sub parts of our larger organization. Companies and individuals within companies, add to this, struggle to learn from each other. We tend to think that our processes in our organization are unique and idiosyncratic. We tend to be very protective of our processes as if that were our competitive advantage. And so businesses don't work together naturally because we're competing. Don't work together to understand what the best of breed solution is. Vendors are also not terribly reliable on this point for obvious reasons. And I talked about this within the last few episodes of the podcast. The economics of the software business is that you need to make software that sells, not software that's great. And we've had this problem in other areas. Music and cinema and the arts, right, have had this challenge of making art that's great art versus making art that makes money. And The critics have bounced among this problem for a long, long time. But the same is true in any line of business, because if you make the app that helps productivity the most, but it doesn't sell, then you're just as out of business as if you'd made a bad app that doesn't sell. So vendors are a little unreliable, although they do have some breadth of understanding across organizations, and particularly in silos of work process. And that's where the original CRM notion came from, was somebody, a vendor wrote a CRM app for one organization, and then they took what they learned there and wrote a CRM for another organization, and thought, okay, well, this is, we're learning the best practices and the best software and trying to implement that in to the software so that it helps with the organization's productivity. But the evidence that that's actually true is a little sketchy. Another challenge that we face is we're accumulating point solutions. So we're solving at the task level, and a conglomeration of products that solve task level problems does not make a system. The exchange of information between tools remains a challenge. So an accumulation of point solutions doesn't make a system any more than an accumulation of tips makes a strategy. It's individual isolated solutions that may or may not work together. If they do work together, it's almost exclusively by chance. Now, I'm not beating on anybody. Managing technology is a challenge. We look back at the history of IT, and going back now 22, 23 years, a guy named Nicholas Carr wrote an article entitled IT Doesn't Matter. And this is 2003. Big IT spend in business generally. IT is still fairly new. We had come off of Y2K, and the dot-com bust had sort of come and gone, and we're back into this thing. In 2003, everybody's hyped up about IT. I certainly was, because I wrote software for a living and managed software teams. And so Nicholas Carr wrote this article, IT Doesn't Matter, got it published in Harvard Business Review, and we didn't believe it. But now, 20 years later, we look backwards in hindsight, and it looks like he might have been right. So I'll explain what his point was, and we'll understand better what his thought was about the productivity of IT. When we look at any sort of technology, the nature of technology is that it wants to become a commodity. It wants to expand. The knowledge wants to get loose. And there are lots of economic forces that drive this idea. People want to adopt the latest technology. Producers want to adopt the latest technology. And so they will pay good money to figure out what that technology is. Vendors who help a company implement technology want to sell that technology to other companies. And so the information spreads, the information behind the technology, the knowledge spreads out. And the history of technology is that it does become a commodity. Another recent example of this, and there are many ancient examples, but a recent example of this is the smartphone. Apple had a big advantage for about 2 years, and they were the ones that built this touch screen. That the shape and size were what they were. The apps were part of the ecosystem, and it didn't take very long at all for that technology to spread to other companies, and now they all make a similar kind of technology. If you didn't know branding, then it would be very hard to distinguish at a distance of about 15 feet one company's smartphone from another company's smartphone. So these similarities tend to come up, and then that's when it becomes a commodity. Carr talked about this with respect to two technologies that he compared to information technology. The two technologies he talked about, one was railroad technology, and the second was electricity. And he looked back at the usage, the adoption of these technologies, and they mirror the adoption of IT. There was huge spend. And did companies actually gain a strategic advantage out of this? And his conclusion was that a company can't gain a strategic advantage with a commodity resource. This is an application of the management theory around the resource-based view of the organization, where an organization's competitiveness is said to rest on one or more resources that are rare, unique, valuable, that have these properties. But the resource-based view does say that resources have to be that way, and that a resource that's going to produce a competitive advantage can't be one that's a commodity that's readily available to everybody. And so Carr lines up with the strategic management literature to say, okay, well, that's where IT is. Now, counter to Carr at the time, we were heavily engaged in custom software. And there weren't as many apps available as there are now. The ecosystems were not quite as straightforward in 2003 as they are in 2025. And so the ability to adopt solutions was not as advanced as it is now. So we were still customizing things. And I think even today in large organizations, if off-the-shelf software is purchased, that it is then customized in many cases. But again, with the point solutions that we've talked about, you don't get a lot of customization. We'll get into that in just a minute. Now, there's also, over the last 40 or 50 years that I'm aware of, been a fair amount of research into systems theory. And a lot of this has application in the business world, because a business from a particular standpoint is a system. The processes that we talked about and the equipment that support us in those processes and the people are components of a system. And so we can use systems theory to discuss how well a business is doing and why perhaps a system might or might not be efficient. And when we look at systems theory, it tells us a couple of things. One is that applied to a business organization, the modern notion of the productivity paradox has to do with the idea that we're automating individual tasks. And I alluded to this earlier, that we're beginning to find great solutions for smaller and smaller components of the process, and we're not aggregating the whole process. And thus that the thinking is that efficiency is in the automation of processes, not in the automation of routine tasks. Well, if you look back at what we said about technology, software creators want to build software that they can sell lots of copies of. And so they're going to try to find tasks that a lot of people do and build a piece of software that helps with that task. And that's a good bit easier to do than it is to go in and do the process work. But with a business, assuming that the processes somehow convey some advantage and productivity to the business, which is what competitive advantage is all about, then we need to automate the process as a whole, because if we automate tasks, then we run the risk of dumbing the process down, so to speak, of turning what could be a competitive advantage process into a most common practice process. And again, based on our previous discussion, you could see how software tends to support the most common practice potentially over the best, most productive, most efficient practice. So there's a big difference between automating tasks and automating processes. And in the organization, the modern productivity paradox theory goes, we need to be automating processes. And this is this systems theory stuff. And when I talk about systems theory, what I mean is this study of larger conglomerated sets of activities that turn into a system. I am not even a qualified amateur on systems theory. I've just read a little bit. So systems theorist out there, if I'm wrong, let's have a conversation. You can correct me and I'll go back in and I'll fix this post. But it's a common thought in systems engineering, and this may or may not be a theoretically or empirically valid statement, but the general thinking when we talk about systems is that if you optimize a sub-process, then you sub-optimize the whole process. Another way to say that is that the optimized process has sub-optimized parts, which is really interesting because I think the perhaps average process thinker might consider that, well, if we optimize all the individual parts, then certainly we have an optimal aggregate group of things that works out into this system. But when we look at what systems engineering actually does, then we would see that they're going to zoom out and they're going to say, okay, well, what's the goal of the system? What are the inputs to the system? And how does the system work through and transform that? I have one of the relatively few number of books I've read on systems engineering is a book called The Goal by Eli Goldratt. And it's really interesting because he writes a book about the productivity of a factory. And he's promoting, it's actually a novelized proscriptive book, a work fable, if you will. And he talks about this factory process, and he's using a theory called the theory of constraints. And what he has his characters do is they go in and they find certain areas of the system that are more critical and works against those. So now we're talking about systems and we're talking about business organizations that have these systems, and we're talking about trying to find IT to support those systems and why that would be the right way to go. So we've got a system. So if we want to make the system as productive as possible, as efficient as possible, to maximize the throughput of the system, then according to the goal, we have to go in and do research, and we have to find the bottleneck and deal with that. So let's back up and see how this might work out in the real world. We've talked before about the notion that faster in and of itself does not make us more productive, and the fact that our IT solutions to date seem to be focused on making us faster at doing the same things versus giving us capabilities to do brand new things that we've never done before. And I've got previous episodes that dig into this and my reasoning behind that. But the idea is that making us faster by itself doesn't make us more efficient. And that's similar to this process thinking and the systems thinking. Because if you make one part of the process faster, the naive view would be, well, that wasted time comes out of the whole system. Well, as it turns out in systems theory, that may or may not be true, which is back to the bottleneck thinking. So the bottleneck in any system is that component of the system that governs the overall throughput of the system. And the theory of constraints is that there's always one or a small number of these subsystems that meets the definition of a bottleneck. And if we're going to proceed with systems efficiency optimization, then what we need to do is to stand back, look at the entire system, set up measurements of how the system is working, and then go through logically and figure out where the backlog is. And then we do everything we can to make the backlog, not the backlog, we do everything that we can to make the bottleneck as efficient as possible. And you could see that all of this makes perfectly good sense, rationally speaking, because if there's a sequential series of things happening, let's say there's 10 steps that need to go and make a piece of wood into a decorative dog sculpture. There's 10 sub processes. And number 6 is the one that is actually performing as the bottleneck. So it's the one that governs the speed of the rest of the system. Well, if you increase the speed of anything before that, or increase the efficiency or the throughput of anything before the bottleneck, then inventory is going to pile up in front of the bottleneck. And then if you improve speed or efficiency or productivity for anything after the bottleneck, then they're going to have a lot of idle time because they're starved for resources because the bottleneck is the constraint. So from this perspective, unless we happen to, by luck perhaps, unless we happen to improve the productivity of the bottleneck without knowing what the bottleneck is, then we're not improving the throughput of the system. In the case that we talked about, turning a block of wood into a decorative sculpture. If there are 10 steps and we don't do the analysis to tell us what the bottleneck is, then we've got a 90% chance of optimizing the wrong one. And thus a 90% chance of making an investment that does not actually improve the productivity of the system. And so if we look back into our software problem, and we look at a process and we go, okay, well, I'm a member of the team that engages with this process. I'm step 8. I look into technology and I want to optimize my part. I don't understand anybody else's part well enough to optimize it. I want to understand my part of this process and I want to optimize that. Then there's a very slim chance that I happen to be on the bottleneck. Now, it may look to me as if I'm the bottleneck. But if I look more closely and understand the system at large, then I may understand that I'm not. So when we look at this, then the modern productivity paradox, the modern version of it, is that we're spending on IT in the wrong places. And we're optimizing sub processes that don't make a lot of difference in the larger flow in the total output of our systems or our businesses. So that's where this notion comes that, yes, we're facing another productivity paradox. Okay, it's constituted differently, but it's still the same thing. So we're spending money on IT. There's another challenge that we face when we choose point solutions over systemic solutions. And I alluded to this earlier, and that is that we then have a set of different solutions in different parts of the organization that our organization is then challenged to support. So if we have 3 different pieces of CRM software in the sales departments of 3 different divisions, and we have a centralized IT function, then they're going to struggle to support that software in all 3 of the divisions because they have to know 3 times as much. And so that's this challenge, is that we not only have, well, basically that we haven't achieved the economies of scale, which is one of the primary points of centralization in organizations. And one of the primary reasons, one of the primary theories that justifies the growth of business is scalability. So we face this challenge both as organizations and as individual users. And I wanted to bring it to you as a knowledge worker, whether you're in an organization, whether you manage people in an organization, or whether you're a solopreneur, because it has to do with how we deploy resources and what we expect to get back from those resources. And if we're engaged in point solutions and optimizing sub processes, then we have every right to expect that our overall productivity is not going to improve. So what do we do about this? I'm big on action steps and how do we resolve this problem? I would say the first step is to be aware of the situation. As I said before, I think there are many people who believe that the best-selling or highest reviewed app is the one that improves our productivity most. Well, I've seen a lot of people adopt a lot of software, and most of the time that software adoption is not supported by data. It's supported by feelings and emotions. I see many people choose software or choose the application that they're going to use because it feels good to them. It makes sense to them. Well, that's fine, and that may be because we have some inherent sense of productivity. It also may fall down to this difference between productivity and convenience. So a lot of times we think things that are easier and faster are more productive, when in point of fact, it may not be. So be aware that there are these problems, these concerns out there. And there's an ongoing argument about this. This is not a settled thing. So it's not trivial. So it's not straightforward. So just be aware of that. And thus study the problem more carefully before you go around spending money at them. I would say also to try to think about optimizing and automating at the process level rather than at the individual task level. It's much easier to try to resolve a problem at the task level because it's smaller. And the larger optimization and automation of a process is very, very challenging because there are multiple steps, multiple users, and there's more things that a software would need to do. But if we can do it at that level, then we're more likely to get a solution that supports productivity of the system rather than sub-optimizations of steps that really don't control the productivity of the system. In other words, at a minimum, we need to look at the entire process and go find the bottleneck and then go to work on the bottleneck first. Now, we battle this because we tend to get impatient with individual tasks. And we tend to think that faster is more productive. And I've argued about this in other places. Faster by itself is not more productive. And it's because of this bottleneck problem. Okay? So when we look at this sort of thing, we probably want to get out to the process level and begin to think about, okay, what's the process? Well, when process engineers look at this sort of thing, systems engineers look at this sort of thing, they start with the output and they say, okay, well, what's the intent of this system or process? And I think all too often, we as individual knowledge workers struggle to do that. So we need to think about our output. And what we tend to do, and this is another system process issue that may have to do with the bottleneck, is we tend to stuff inputs into the system. And here's an example. So let's say you are in the knowledge work business and you are a consultant and the product that gets you paid is consulting results. In other words, you get into an organization and you coach them, and that direct consult, that direct exchange of information is what you actually get paid for. It's fairly easy to get involved in the inputs to that process. So, for example, you would have to read a lot in order to understand the solutions and be able to measure one against another so that you can walk into an organization and you can consult with them and you can say, okay, here's the solution that's most likely to solve your problem. Well, it would be easy then to say, ooh, the more reading I do, the better my output is going to be. Well, maybe so, maybe not. If we do fall prey to that, then what we're doing is we're actually increasing the amount of input. And when we look at productivity, it's an efficiency question. And efficiency, as we know, is simple math. Efficiency is outputs divided by inputs. Now, if your equation is outputs divided by inputs, okay, equals productivity, and you want productivity to go up, do you want to increase inputs or do you want to decrease inputs? Well, for the math to work, you want to decrease the inputs. If you increase the inputs, then the productivity is going to go down because you're not also increasing the outputs. And when we engage in processes in business, we tend to just think, oh, well, the turning of wood into a sculpture is automatic, so I'll just get more wood and then I'll produce more outputs. Well, systems theory argues against that. Systems theory argues that if there's not currently, there will eventually be a bottleneck. and a constraint such that the system stops its linear production. In other words, for certain changes in quantity, the relationship between inputs and outputs is linear. So if you increase the inputs, you will increase the outputs. But that's for small bands of the number spectrum. And eventually you'll reach, as you increase production, you'll reach a bottleneck. And then that mathematical relationship stops holding. And there's a lot of metaphors for this, and the Japanese management methods and all of the Toyota production system work helped to figure some of this out. So the point is that we want to get out and measure at the process level. And so anytime we're engaging in an efficiency, in an improvement process, we've got to recognize that it's an experiment. And so if we can zoom out and we can measure at the process level, measure our outputs, and do the things that increase our outputs. Don't worry so much about increasing the inputs unless you absolutely have to. As we're measuring those outputs, we have the data that we need to support the trial and error improvement of our process. We've identified what our output actually is, and sometimes this is a challenge. I'll give you another example of the challenge of identifying the output. It would be easy for me to think that my primary output is this podcast, but it's not. My primary output is people who sit in attention compass implementation class. Now, the podcast may have an impact on the number of people who sit down, but they're not the same. So it's easy to fall into this trap. So if we're measuring outputs, then we have the data that we need to start experimenting with our process. So that's one reason why we want to zoom out and measure at the process level rather than getting trapped at the task level. Now, the other is that with that data, we can begin to build a model. Okay. And models are not trivial. I did a podcast months ago about the notion of mental models, right? And we talked about models there. And models are very challenging because they can't contain all the detail. So when we look at this system and at these business processes, there's really not a modeling language. So we have to do the experiment. So that is back to this trial and error, this scientific approach, this invention approach is to understand what the output is, right? And then the other is that we then have the opportunity to look at the system as a system, right? Two reasons to measure at the process level. The second one is we have the opportunity to look at this process as a system and really start making interventions that actually make the number of outputs go up. So where are we? Let's zoom back out in our process and think about what have we done, what have we said, what have we learned? So we have to engage in technology. We face the productivity paradox with information technology, and quite frankly, probably with any technology. The productivity paradox was a big deal in the 90s. It went underground for a little while, but now it's coming back as our spending on IT increases, both at the organizational level and at the individual level. The modern version of the productivity paradox is that we're not looking at solutions at a systemic level. We're looking at solutions at a task level. We try to find software that helps us do a task faster. And for multiple reasons, that may not help us improve our productivity, because productivity is all about outputs. Add to that the problem that the more distinct tools you have, the more trade-offs you have. The more data movements you have from subsystem A to subsystem B. Okay, and each one of those is expensive. And then the more different things that you have to support and get good at. So we talked a little bit about systems theory and the challenges of managing technology at this level. And we came out with this notion of beginning to look at our own processes and our own productivity from a systemic perspective. Okay. Drill this down. What does this mean to you on a day-to-day basis? Be very careful to focus on your outputs, your productive outputs, and to not get distracted by increasing the amount of inputs that you're able to process, because that may be wasted effort. Always go to the outputs and then look back. So as you're buying your own technology and as you're investing in your own productivity and your own systems, look at it from that perspective. What increases my outputs? And then work backwards from that into a set of tools that will help you as you go forward. Now, why am I talking about all this sort of stuff? Well, first of all, it's a good rule for productivity is to look at the system and let's do efficiency in the process level rather than at the individual task level. So I want you to be more productive, so you need to be armed with this kind of thinking. Second, of course, is I have a system for you. And that's what the attention compass is it's a complete solution for our productivity. It doesn't optimize any single step, but it does improve throughput of the entire system because I'm focused on the output. The output of any productivity process in general is task completion. And that's why we talk about the task and attention management system, because we manage tasks in such a way that tasks get done. When tasks get done, productivity happens in knowledge work. So, love to talk with you more about this. If you face this problem, you want to do some systems level analysis for yourself or for your organization, I can help you think through that sort of thing. You can reach out to me and we'll get together and sit down and make an appointment. I'll give you an hour of coaching and we'll talk about where you are individually with your productivity, or we'll think about where your organization is with the larger group productivity, and we'll organize some potential interventions there. I'd love to hear what your challenges are here. And so reach out to me if you want to. You can find me on LinkedIn, Larry Tribble, Ph.D., not hard to find there, or you can reach out to me directly via my email address, which is larry@dobusyright.com. Again, take a look at your systems. Keep focused on what your outputs are. Don't get distracted by doing more inputs. And this is a great way for you to begin to do busy right. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the attention compass process. Attention compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week. more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.